I'm going to sit up on the shooting line and just hear him say it out loud. That score doesn't make you an expert. He said it like a joke, like something to get a laugh out of the guys behind me, and for 1 second the whole range went quiet in that specific way a room goes quiet right before somebody gets humiliated. I remember looking down at my hands instead of his face. I remember thinking, okay, Randall. You have no idea what you just picked up. That's Randall Voss, lead range instructor, 40-something, the kind of man who wears his expired unit patches on his vest like they're still active orders. He ran that training floor like it was his personal kingdom, and everybody let him, because nobody wanted to be the next target. I was the newest hire at Kalman's Precision Training Academy, an ex-Army designated marksman with 11 months out of uniform and a folder full of paperwork nobody had bothered to actually open. He looked at that folder for maybe 4 seconds before he decided he already knew everything about me. 2 weeks later I was standing in a recertification hearing in the Academy's back office, watching the director's hands go still over a single printed page. Watching him read it twice. Watching him look up at me like the numbers on that page didn't match the woman standing in front of him, and then look up at Randall, waiting behind me with his arms crossed and his jaw set, like the numbers definitely didn't match him either. Wait, the director said, and something in his voice cracked just slightly, right down the middle. This is the highest score we've ever seen. To understand how it got to that room, you have to go back to my first morning on that range, when Randall Voss decided he already knew exactly who I was. My name's Mara Kessler. 29 years old at the time, 5 years as an Army-designated marksman, 2 deployments, 1 very quiet job title that never made it onto a resume because half of it was still technically covered by paperwork I couldn't discuss. When I got out, I wanted something simple: teach civilians how to shoot safely, work with veterans transitioning like I was, build a life that didn't require me to be anywhere at 0400 unless I chose to be. Kalman's Precision was hiring instructors. I walked in with my DD-214, my NRA certifications, my old training logs, and, tucked at the very back of the folder, almost as an afterthought, a single scorecard from my last deployment that I hadn't looked at in over a year. Randall interviewed me for exactly 6 minutes. He didn't ask about my deployments. He didn't ask what designated marksman actually meant in practice, what the job cost, what it demanded from a body and a mind under 120 degrees of desert heat. He asked if I'd shot competitively, and when I said no, not really, competitions weren't exactly available where I'd been stationed, he wrote something down and moved on like I'd confirmed a suspicion he already had. I got hired anyway. The academy needed instructors, and I could clearly, demonstrably shoot, but from day one, Randall treated me like a hire he'd been overruled on. He'd correct my stance in front of students I was actively teaching, not because the stance was wrong, but because he wanted them to see him correct me. He'd take over my range sessions just to check form, and then run them the rest of the hour like I'd been dismissed. Small things, at first, the kind of thing you can almost convince yourself you're imagining, except I wasn't imagining the way his voice changed when he talked to me versus when he talked to Doug, the other new instructor, who'd done 4 years stateside and never left a training base. Doug got good work. I got we'll see. The one person on that floor who saw it clearly from day one was Priya Anand, 26, my closest friend on staff, a firearms safety instructor with sharper eyes than half the range and absolutely zero patience for men like Randall. Priya used to lean against the wall behind the counter during my sessions, arms crossed, watching him hover over my students like he was auditioning for a role nobody asked him to play. He does this to every woman who walks in here with a service record, she told me once, quiet, over coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier. You're not imagining it. I've been keeping a list. She had, too. A literal running note in her phone, dates, comments, the specific things he'd said to female hires versus the male ones. I didn't know it yet, but that list would matter more than either of us understood sitting there in that break room. What I knew, at the time, was just this: I had 11 months of practice shrinking myself down to a size that made Randall Voss comfortable, and I was tired down to the bone of doing it. Because here's the thing about being a designated marksman in a combat zone, it doesn't leave room for doubt. You don't get to hesitate on a windage call because someone might think you're overreacting. You don't get to second-guess a range estimate because it feels aggressive to be that certain out loud. I spent 5 years building a kind of precision that had nothing to do with ego and everything to do with keeping people alive, mine and otherwise, and I was good at it. Not pretty good for a woman good. Good, full stop, in a way that a handful of very serious people had signed their names to confirm. There was a range session, maybe 6 weeks in, that I still think about. A group of new students, half of them veterans themselves, running a timed drill I'd designed, multiple targets, transitions under a clock, the kind of drill that actually tells you something about a shooter instead of just their grouping on a static paper target. I ran it clean. Every target, every transition, inside the time. One of the older guys in the group, a retired cop, 60-something, built like a fence post, turned around afterward and just said, "Lo, where'd you learn that?" Not a question really. More like a man recalibrating something in real time. Randall was standing at the back of the range for that one. He didn't say anything to me directly. He waited until the students had cleared out, walked over, glanced at my target sheet like it personally offended him, and said, "Nice grouping." Doesn't mean much without pressure behind it, though. I remember the exact angle of the afternoon light coming through the range windows when he said that. I remember thinking about pressure, actual pressure, the kind where a miss doesn't cost you a ranking on a leaderboard, it costs somebody their life, and I remember saying nothing at all. Just nodding, and walking away, filing it into a place I was keeping very carefully organized. That's the internal ledger nobody ever sees from the outside. Every comment. Every dismissal. Every time a man who'd never left a domestic training base decided he understood combat marksmanship better than someone who'd actually practiced it under fire. I wasn't keeping score to be bitter. I was keeping score because somewhere underneath the exhaustion, I already knew, I wasn't going to fix this by getting louder in the moment. I was going to fix it by making sure that when the moment came, the record would speak so clearly that nobody in the room would be able to argue with it. Priya was the one who finally said it out loud, one night after close, both of us stacking chairs in the empty classroom. "You have your last deployment scorecard, right? The actual one, signed off?" I told her I did, somewhere, packed away with everything else I hadn't looked at since separating. "Then stop letting him define what your record says," she said. "Make him read it himself." I didn't answer right away. Something about the idea sat heavy in my chest, not fear, exactly, more like the particular weight of finally deciding to stop absorbing something and start setting it down where everyone could see it. The decision crystallized about a month later, when Randall did something I couldn't just file away and walk past. The academy ran an annual instructor recertification. Every trainer on staff had to re-qualify on a standardized precision course, scores posted, rankings compared, the whole thing overseen by the academy director. Randall announced it in a staff meeting with this little smile, looking directly at me while he said it, like he already knew how the story was going to end. "Should be a good chance to see where everybody actually stacks up," he said. "Talk's cheap on a resume." A few people laughed, the way people laugh when they're relieved it's not aimed at them. I decided, right there, that I wasn't going to fight this in the meeting, or in the break room, or in some hallway confrontation that would just become another data point on his side, the emotional woman, overreacting, exactly the story he already believed. I was going to fight it inside the system he trusted, using the exact standards he claimed to respect. If he wanted a record, I'd bring him the most complete one that existed. The quiet part of this, the part nobody sees in the highlight reel, is how much unglamorous work goes into building a case out of paper. I spent 3 weekends going through boxes I'd shipped home and never fully unpacked, separating orders from evaluations from the actual, official scorecards that mattered. I found my qualification records from both deployments. I found the after-action documentation from the specific engagement that had earned me a commendation I'd never once mentioned at work, because it felt like bragging, because I'd learned a long time ago that talking about it made certain men in certain rooms visibly uncomfortable. I requested my full official record through the right channel, a formal records request, not a favor, not a phone call to an old commander, a documented, time-stamped process that would make the paper trail unimpeachable. I asked Priya to keep her notes formatted the way HR would actually want them, dated and specific, no editorializing. I looked up the Academy's own recertification bylaws, buried in an employee handbook nobody read past page 4, and found the clause that let any instructor request their qualification be reviewed by the director directly, in the event of a dispute regarding evaluation standards. I filed that request myself, quietly, 3 days before the annual course, and told exactly no one except Priya. She asked me, the night before, if I was scared. I told her the truth, I wasn't scared of the course. I'd run harder drills under worse conditions with people's lives actually depending on the outcome. What I was bracing for was something smaller and stranger, the moment right after, when the paper finally did the talking, and I'd have to watch a man's whole understanding of me collapse in real time. There's a particular kind of nerve required for that. Not the nerve to shoot straight. The nerve to just let the truth land, without softening it, without making it easier on him. The recertification ran on a Thursday morning in October, cold enough that our breath fogged over the firing line. Randall ran the course himself, timer in hand, calling drills in that flat, bored voice he used whenever he wanted to signal he already knew the outcome. I ran it clean, better than clean, actually, tighter groupings under time pressure than I'd posted in practice, the kind of performance that happens when a body finally stops holding something back. When the scores went up on the board, mine sat at the top, and I watched Randall's jaw do a small, involuntary thing before he caught himself and moved on to the next name like nothing had happened. But a top score on a range in Ohio wasn't the point, and we both knew it. He'd made his comment about pressure, about talk being cheap, about deployment scores that supposedly didn't prove anything, and that comment was still sitting out there, unanswered, in front of the same staff who'd heard it. So I did the thing I'd been quietly building toward for a month. I requested the formal review, invoked that clause from the handbook, and asked that my full qualification record, the actual field one, not just the range day paperwork, be entered for the director's review, with Randall present as the instructor of record. The review happened 4 days later, in the Academy's back office, the director sitting behind a desk cluttered with binders, Randall standing near the door with his arms crossed in that same posture he always used when he thought he'd already won. Director Whitfield, late 50s, 20 years running training programs, a man who genuinely cared about the Academy's standards even when his instructors didn't always live up to them, read through my range day scores first, nodding along, unremarkable, exactly what he expected from a strong hire. Then I handed him the second folder. He opened it slowly, the way people open things they don't yet know are about to matter. I watched his eyes move down the page, my official qualification scorecard from my final deployment, signed, dated, verified through channels that don't leave room for embellishment. I watched him read it once. I watched him go back and read it again, slower, like he needed to be sure he wasn't misreading a number. And then he looked up, first at me, like he was checking that the woman in front of him actually matched the record in his hands, and then at Randall, waiting by the door with an expression that hadn't caught up yet to what was happening. "Wait," Director Whitfield said, and his voice did that thing where it drops half a register because the person speaking has genuinely surprised themselves. "This is the highest score we've ever seen." Nobody in that office moved for a second. I felt something loosen in my chest that had been clenched for months, quiet and tight, without me even fully noticing it was there. Randall's arms came uncrossed. His mouth opened slightly, and then closed again, because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't make things worse. Whitfield kept reading, the specific engagement notes, the commendation I'd never once mentioned in a break room, the evaluator comments from a company commander who didn't hand out praise lightly and had written, in blunt, unadorned language, that my precision under fire had directly protected 2 other soldiers in a situation I still didn't talk about in detail with anyone outside the people who'd been there. He read it out loud, actually, not the confidential tactical specifics, but the scoring language, the certifications, the raw numbers, read it into the room like a man putting something on the record because he understood, instinctively, that saying it quietly wouldn't be enough. "Randall," he said, not unkindly, but not softly either, "did you review MS?" Kessler's full file when she was hired? I watched Randall's face do the thing faces do when a person is being asked, in front of a witness, to admit something they've spent months avoiding admitting to themselves. I saw her application, he said, which wasn't an answer, and everyone in that room, including him, knew it wasn't an answer. Whitfield didn't press further. He didn't need to. He just closed the folder, set it on the desk between us like a verdict, and said the thing that I'd been quietly building toward for a month without ever once saying it myself: this is exactly the kind of instructor we should be building our program around. The comment about pressure, about talk being cheap, it just sat there in the room, unspoken but undeniable, already answered before anyone bothered to bring it back up. Priya was waiting outside when I finally walked out of that office, leaning against the same wall she always leaned against. And I didn't have to say a single word for her to know exactly how it had gone. She just grinned, wide and unguarded, and said, "Highest score they've ever seen, huh," like she'd known it the entire time, because she had. That's the moment the story could have just ended. Vindication delivered, record corrected, a bad manager quietly humbled in front of his boss. Except that's not actually where it went, because Director Whitfield wasn't the kind of man who fixed one problem and called it finished. 3 weeks later, the Academy rolled out a new hiring and evaluation policy, one that Whitfield asked me to help draft, sitting across from him in that same back office, this time with coffee instead of a closed folder between us. Every instructor candidate's full service record now had to be formally reviewed by 2 people, not 1, before any hiring decision was made, and any instructor comments made about a candidate's qualifications during training had to be logged and signed. Priya's list, the quiet running record she'd kept on her phone for months, became, unofficially, the first piece of evidence anyone had ever actually acted on. She told me later that half the reason she started keeping it was because she hoped, someday, somebody would finally ask. Randall stayed on staff, technically, but not for long, and not in the same role. Whitfield moved him off new hire evaluations entirely, quietly, the kind of reassignment that doesn't need an announcement because everyone on the floor understands exactly what it means. He was still there some mornings, running general classes, noticeably smaller in the room than he used to be, the kind of smaller that comes from a man realizing his certainty was never actually as solid as his volume made it sound. I never gloated. I didn't need to. The paperwork had already said everything I would have wanted to say myself, said it better, said it in a way nobody could dismiss as emotion. 2 years on, I run the precision program at that academy now, Priya still beside me most days, still keeping notes, though these days they're mostly about which students are ready to move up a level. New instructors go through an onboarding process that includes, as its very first step, a full review of their actual record, not a 6-minute conversation and a guess. Sometimes a new hire will ask me, half joking, if I've got war stories, and I'll tell them the same thing every time. I've got exactly one story I actually care about telling, and it's not about a deployment. It's about a scorecard, and a man who assumed a number on a page couldn't possibly belong to me, and how wrong, how completely, provably wrong, he turned out to be. If you've ever had somebody take one look at your record and decide they already knew your whole story better than you did, I want to hear it in the comments. I read every single one. And if this kind of story is the reason you're here, hit subscribe, because there's a lot more where this came from, and I promise you, the paperwork always talks eventually.